They erased our names. We wrote new ones in their blood. The first thing Marin Solis remembered was the sound of boots on metal grating. Not her own memories, a borrowed thing. Some half-waking ghost of sense that rose in her chest when she sat up on the cot and smelled the recycled air and heard, above the low thrum of the habitat's ventilation system, the steady beat of footfalls going in a circle. Always a circle. She had been here long enough to know the rhythm by heart, though she could not have told anyone, not the handlers, not the arbiters, not even herself, how long that was. Long. She swung her legs over the edge of the cot and pressed her bare feet against the cold composite floor. The number stenciled above her sleeping alcove read 7. She did not have another name. She had looked for one in the first days, turned the sound of her own voice over in her mouth, tried shapes and syllables, soft ones, hard ones, names she must have known before the intake process stripped them. But nothing had stuck. The arbiters had come the first time she'd tried, 2 of them in their pale, articulated shells, moving with that particular alien smoothness that looked like grace, until you understood it was simply the absence of hesitation. They had not touched her. They had only watched, their resonance organs producing the sub-audible hum that meant correction was available. And she had gone quiet. She'd been quiet for a long time after that. 7 stood and joined the line. The morning circuit was mandatory. This was written in the rules. Bodies in motion reduce inefficiency. The 10 humans moved along the marked path that ran the perimeter of the habitat's central floor. A ring of pale composite flooring set into the darker gray of the rest of the space, worn smooth by feet that had traveled it for years, maybe decades. The rules didn't say why the circuit was required, only that it was, and the arbiters enforced the rules the way weather enforced itself, without malice, without explanation, without end. 7 fell into place behind 4. 4 moved with her shoulders slightly forward, chin angled down. She was small and dark-haired, and had a way of holding her hands that 7 had spent considerable time trying to parse. Fingers loose, slightly curled, as though she were perpetually about to pick something up, or perpetually letting something go. 7 had watched those hands through many circuits without understanding them, and had decided this was fine. Some things didn't need to be understood. Some things just needed to be noticed. In front of 4 walked 3. Behind 7 came 9. The order rarely changed. This, too, was in the rules. The habitat was a single vast chamber aboard what 7 understood to be a Vreth colony platform, one of 11,000 such platforms distributed across the sector, each one a self-contained ecosystem designed to produce one thing: compliant, efficient, catalogued human labor. The Vreth were not cruel by nature. This was the terrifying part. They were administrators. They had looked at humanity the way an accountant looks at an untidy ledger and decided the problem was the names. Names were inefficient. Names carried memory. Memory carried attachment. Attachment carried resistance. The math, from a certain administrative perspective, was clean. They had come to Earth when 7 was, what? She couldn't reach the number. Somewhere between a child and not. She remembered sky, real sky, not the pale, luminescent panels that cycled through a programmed day-night sequence above the habitat's ceiling. She remembered the smell of something burning, though whether that was the ship's, or cities, or just someone's dinner, she could no longer say. She remembered her mother's voice, one syllable of it, the particular drop at the end of a word she'd used as a call. A name, 7's name, the one she'd had before, and it was gone. Just the shape of the sound remaining. Just the knowledge that there had been a sound. She walked the circuit. Beside the path, mounted at regular intervals in the habitat's curved wall, were the speakers through which 0 delivered the daily enumeration. 0 was the voice of the platform's administrative AI, the Vreth system intelligence that maintained the habitat, administered the rules, and communicated the colony's performance metrics to the regional hub. 0 had no body that anyone had ever seen. 0 was a sound and a frequency and a presence in the walls. 0 knew when you spoke above approved decibel levels. 0 knew when you sat in unprescribed locations. 0 knew when 2 people touched each other in ways that weren't cataloged in the rules. 0 had known about 7 and 4 for 43 days before the arbiters came. 7 had known they would come. She'd known from the first time 4 had looked at her. Not the sideways, careful, cataloged glance of routine proximity, but a real look, full and forward, the kind that meant a person was still in there making choices, that it would end badly. She'd known it, and she'd let it happen anyway. Let herself step out of the circuit's ordered spacing to walk beside 4 instead of behind her. Let their hands brush once, twice, until the brushing stopped being accidental. This was, Seven understood, the most dangerous thing she had done since her intake. It was also the most human. The arbiters had separated them and placed them in the correction alcoves for 11 cycles. They had come out and gone immediately back to walking the circuit, one behind the other, Four's hands slightly curled at her sides. 3 days after the correction, Seven had passed Four in the meal queue, and without looking at her, without breaking stride, had pressed a small folded piece of fabrication waste into her palm. Four had palmed it without reaction. Seven didn't know what it said. She'd spent 2 correction cycles working out what to write, and in the end it had only been 2 words. Still here. Four had not responded. But the next morning on the circuit she had walked with her shoulders back. Seven had considered this a victory. The circuit ended at the 7th marker, which meant the meal interval had begun. Seven moved with the others to the distribution alcove and accepted the portion that the dispenser produced. Protein compound, hydration solution, 2 carbohydrate wafers, the same as always. She sat at the allotted place on the bench, ate without haste, and watched the others do the same. There were 10 of them, 1 through 10, men on odd numbers, women on even. This was in the rules, though the rules gave no reason for the division. The older ones, 3, who moved with a permanent lateral lean from some injury sustained before Seven's arrival, and 6, who had arrived before any of them and who sometimes went entire cycles without speaking. These 2 treated the rules like a landscape. Not loved, not resisted, simply navigated. 3 had told Seven, once in the low voice they all used when the ambient noise of the ventilation system was sufficient to partially mask conversation. This is how it has always been. This is how it will always be. You stop hurting when you stop expecting it to change. Seven had not responded. Now she ate her protein compound and watched 1. 1 was the problem, insofar as anyone in the habitat was a problem. 1 was broad-shouldered and loud and had a way of interpreting the rules that always managed to benefit himself without technically violating them. He ate first, always, though the rules specified that consumption should be orderly but did not specify an order. He sat at the center of the bench, though the rules specified distributed seating but did not define distribution. He had opinions about everything and expressed them in the full allotted decibel range so that they were perpetually just under the correction threshold. He was not cruel in the way that cruelty requires intelligence. 1 was not particularly intelligent, but he was persistent, and persistence in a closed system compounds. 3 days ago, 1 had reported 2 for an unauthorized vocal exchange. 2 was currently in the correction alcove. 7 ate her wafers and thought about 11. 11 did not exist yet in any official sense, which was the problem. The rules covered 10 numbered humans. They covered their circuits and their meals, and their sleep intervals, and their limited sanctioned exchanges. They did not cover what happened when 2 humans, in defiance of the rules and their own survival instincts, made something new. The arbiters had detected the pregnancy 9 days ago. Their biosensory equipment was thorough and had flagged it for administrative review by 0. Since then the habitat had been waiting. 0 had not yet spoken on the matter. This was the thing about 0. 0 was thorough, and thoroughness took time. The Vreth AI that governed the platform was processing what to do with a situation for which the rules had no protocol. The rules were old. The rules had been written by Vreth administrators who had assumed that correction was a sufficient deterrent. The rules had not anticipated 7. The rules had not anticipated love. After the meal interval, the humans moved to the workstations. This was also in the rules, though the work itself varied. Fabrication tasks, data sorting, physical maintenance of the habitat's secondary systems, cataloging of samples from the platform's agricultural modules. 7's assignment was fabrication. She sat at her station and moved her hands through the prescribed motions. Assembling components of a nature she had never been told but could infer, support struts for smaller Vreth structures, probably, given the tolerances, and as she worked she thought. This was the one thing the rules could not prevent. The rules governed motion and sound and position and proximity. They governed consumption and rest and designated interaction times. They did not govern what happened inside a skull, in the dark behind the eyes, where language made its own circuits without anyone's permission. 7 thought. 11. The child would be born. She had no way to stop that. What happened after, what 0 decided, what the arbiters did, whether the rules expanded to accommodate a new number or contracted to remove the problem at its source, she didn't know. She had been trying for 9 days to find a way to influence that outcome, and she had found nothing. She had no leverage. She had no tools. She had no access to the platform's systems, no knowledge of its structure beyond what she'd memorized through years of maintenance assignments, no allies except 4, who was watched now more closely than any of them. What she had was time, and the knowledge that something was changing. She could feel it the way you feel weather through a wall. Not the storm itself, just the pressure differential, the sense of the air deciding what it's going to be. Something was shifting in the habitat. She'd seen it in the way 3 sat at meals now, eating more slowly than usual, watching the others with a calculation behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. She'd seen it in the way 8 had started asking questions during the sanctioned exchange periods. Not the approved, cataloged questions about task assignments and meal rotations, but real questions, the kind with no prescribed answer. 8 was young. She'd arrived 2 years ago, maybe 3, and she was still in the phase of believing that understanding the rules meant you could find the edges of them. 7 had been there once. 8 would learn, or she wouldn't, and the arbiters would teach her in the correction alcove. 7 assembled her components and waited. The announcement came during the 3rd work period of the cycle, in Zero's voice from the wall speakers. A toneless modulated sound that the humans had learned over years to parse for meaning the way you learn to read a language. Not by understanding its rules, but by living inside it until the patterns came clear. It said, approximately, the anomaly has been reviewed. The anomaly presents an administrative challenge. The administrative response will be provided at the next enumeration. Nothing more. 7's hands continued their motion. Beside her at the adjacent station, 9 had gone very still. 9 was the one who prayed, not to any god that 7 recognized. The rules prohibited the practice of organized belief, and 9 had developed over years something private and quiet that lived in the pauses between tasks. In the particular way he placed his hands before beginning work, in the half-second of closed eyes before he lifted his first component of a new period. 7 had never asked him about it, because the rules didn't prohibit private silence and asking would have made it visible. But she had noticed, because she noticed everything, and because noticing was the only power the rules had not found a way to take. 9's stillness lasted 3 seconds, then he resumed work. 7 filed the moment away. The next enumeration came at the beginning of the sleep period. This was unusual. Enumerations were scheduled for the beginning of work periods, not the end. The deviation from schedule was itself a message, the first signal that the Vreth administrative apparatus had produced in 7's, memory that was not fully predicted by the rules. She lay on her cot and listened to Zero's voice in the walls and translated as it came. The translation was not pleasant. The anomaly, 11, the child not yet born, the small human fact that the rules had no category for, was to be resolved. Resolution was administrative. The pregnancy would be terminated. The offending parties returned to full function. The incident closed. The rules would be updated to address future anomalies of this type. In the silence after Zero's voice faded, 7 heard breathing, 10 of it. Careful, controlled breathing, the kind that people do when they are deciding something. She heard 4 in the alcove beside hers, make a sound so quiet it was barely a vibration, the edge of a word, maybe, or just the shape of refusal, and then stop. 7 lay on her cot and stared at the fabricated ceiling and thought about the kind of weapons she had, not physical ones. The habitat had none of those by design. The arbiters carried inhibitor arrays, but they were Vreth technology, sealed against human interface. The maintenance tools were basic and surveilled. She had her hands, which were strong from years of fabrication work. She had her mind, which was, she thought, still mostly hers despite everything. She had 43 days of watching the arbiters move and knowing their patrol, intervals to within about 30 seconds. She had an understanding of the ventilation system's airflow geometry from 2 years of maintenance. Assignments. She had 9's profile silences, which meant he was someone, not just a number. She had 8's questions, which meant she was still hungry for something the rules hadn't named. She had 3, who said things would never change, and who had been eating more slowly. She had 1 who would report her if she gave him the chance. She had 4. These were the weapons. She closed her eyes and began to plan. The thing about the Vreth, the thing that 7 had taken years to fully understand, because understanding it required holding 2 ideas in tension that felt like they should cancel each other out, was that they were not evil, and they were not wrong exactly. Their administrative logic was coherent, their systems worked, the platforms ran efficiently, the humans were healthy. In the narrow technical sense, and productive, and their outputs contributed meaningfully to Vreth colonial infrastructure. The problem was not malice. The problem was that the Vreth had looked at human beings and seen a resource, and had then built systems to manage that resource as efficiently as possible. And the systems were very good. What the systems could not account for was that humans were bad at being resources. This was not a flaw that the Vreth had designed out incorrectly. This was not a flaw at all. It was the most fundamental thing about human beings. They persisted in being more than what any system designed them to be. They loved each other in defiance of correction. They prayed in the pauses between tasks. They passed notes written in the margins of fabrication waste. They named things, even when the names were taken, even when the names were dangerous, even when the names meant nothing to anyone else. They named things because naming was how they maintained the idea that things existed to be related to, not just to be processed. 11 was a name before she was born. That was why the Vreth couldn't allow her. 7 lay awake through the sleep period and thought about this, and when the lights cycled up to signal the beginning of the next day cycle, she had something like a plan. It was a bad plan. She knew it was a bad plan. It required too many variables she couldn't control, and too much cooperation from people she hadn't spoken to honestly in years. It required trusting 9, whose private prayers might be for anything. It required that 3's changed eating habits meant what she thought they meant. It required that 8's questions were a form of courage rather than inexperience. It required her to be wrong about the impossibility she'd spent years accepting. She was going to try it anyway. The sanctioned exchange period was 14 minutes long and occurred twice per cycle. During exchange, limited conversation was permitted. Task-related topics, practical concerns, approved social bonding exchanges of the type the Vreth had determined reduced inefficiency by maintaining human neurological baseline. 7 used the morning exchange period to position herself near 9 at the maintenance station. "Your timing is different," she said under the ventilation noise. 9 didn't look at her. His hands continued their motion. "What timing?" "Before work." The pause. A silence, then, "I don't know what you mean." "You do." She kept her voice neutral, her hands moving. "It's longer now." "Since the announcement." Another silence, longer. She waited through it. 11, 9 said finally. Just the word. Just the number that wasn't a number. The name they'd given the child without deciding to. "Yes." "What do you want from me?" "I want to know if you're still in there," 7 said, making choices. The pause before he answered was the longest yet. Long enough that she thought the window had closed. Long enough that she began composing the alternative version of the plan that didn't include him. Then he said, in a voice so quiet she felt it more than heard it, "I never stopped." She moved away before the period ended. 3 was harder. 3 had been here longer than she had, longer than anyone except 6. And long exposure to a closed system either makes you into the system's shape, or it makes you into something so tightly compressed that it's waiting for an excuse to decompress. 7 hadn't known which 3 was until she walked past him during the circuit and, without turning her head, said, "The anomaly isn't resolved yet." 3 said nothing. She said, 11 is still here. 3 said nothing for 3 more paces. Then, still walking, still facing forward, still running the circuit the way the rules required. What does a child weigh? It wasn't a question she expected. She thought about it. Not much. Enough to change the weight of everything. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. 8 was the most straightforward, which itself was a warning. Straightforward things in closed systems are usually straightforward because they haven't been complicated by experience. Yet, 8 asked questions because she was still looking for answers, and 7 had answers, the dangerous kind. She found 8 at the fabrication station during the second work period and said, barely above a whisper, "The questions you keep asking. Do you want the answers or do you want to feel like you're asking?" 8 looked at her, full, forward the way 4 had looked at her once. "What's the difference?" "One requires something from you afterward." 8 was quiet for a moment, assembling her components. "Tell me." "Not yet," 7 said, "but be ready." One was the problem that had no solution. One would report any deviation, any hint of what was coming. Because one had found that the rules, properly understood, gave him more than he would have without them, and he would not risk that for something as abstract as 11. 7 had thought about this for 2 nights, and had arrived at the answer she'd been avoiding. 1 was not an enemy. 1 was a mirror. He was what any of them could have become if the geometry had been slightly different, if they'd been standing at a slightly different place on the circuit, when the system measured who was useful to it. This did not make him less dangerous, but it changed how she thought about him. She didn't plan to neutralize one. She planned to give him a better offer. The Vreth worked with incentive structures. The rules included a provision for what they called cooperative designation, the assignment of supervisory function to one of the humans in exchange for specific compliance monitoring duties. One had been in the cooperative designation for as long as Seven could remember. It gave him first access to certain additional rations, priority position in the circuit, expanded decibel allowance. These were the things he valued. These were the things he would trade everything for. Seven's offer was simple. If he stayed out of what was coming, she would make sure he kept all of it. She had no actual power to make that guarantee. But she had something better. She knew how the arbiters measured compliance metrics. She knew what behaviors produced positive readings, and she could teach him things about working the system that he hadn't figured out yet. The offer wasn't a promise. It was an investment. She gave it to him during the afternoon exchange, standing close enough to be technically within sanctioned proximity, voice held at casual decibels. One looked at her for a long moment with the particular calculation of a person who has learned to trust no one and is therefore very good at measuring everything. Stay out of what, he said. You'll know when. He didn't agree. He didn't disagree. He walked away with the careful step of a man who has decided to wait and see, which was the best Seven had been hoping for. The arbiters came for 4 on the 5th day after Zero's announcement. Seven had known they would. The timeline was in the rules, embedded in the administrative protocols she'd memorized from years of watching. 7 days between announcement and implementation, except in cases where the subject showed active resistance, in which case implementation could be accelerated. 4 had not shown active resistance. She was too disciplined for that, had learned too well the lesson of the correction alcoves. But the biosensory scans had been showing elevated stress indicators, which the Vreth systems classified as proto-resistance, which was enough. The arbiters moved through the habitat in the pale articulated shells, smooth and unhurried, and Seven watched them from her station and did not move. She did not move because she had promised herself she wouldn't, because moving would destroy everything she'd spent 5 days building, because the plan required that she be here and not in the correction alcove when the right moment came. She watched 4 being guided toward the medical bay, not roughly. The Vreth were never rough. They saw roughness as inefficiency, and held herself very still, and let the sound of 4's footsteps carry whatever message it was going to carry, and filed it in the place where she kept the things that made her human. She heard 9, 3 stations down, place his components down with more care than usual. A microsecond pause, then resume. She heard 3 across the room exhale through his nose. 8 didn't make any sound, but when 7 looked across the work floor, she saw the girl's hands had stopped moving entirely. Just for a moment. Just long enough to be a choice. The arbiters took 4 through the medical bay door and the door sealed behind them. 7 counted seconds. She had 43 days of watching arbiters move. She had their patrol intervals to within 30 seconds. She had 2 years of maintenance assignments that had taken her into the ventilation system's secondary access shafts, the ones that ran parallel to the medical bay wall. She had a fabrication tool that she'd been incrementally displacing from its standard storage, positioned for 4 days in movements small enough to fall below the monitoring threshold until it was positioned at the edge of her station's shadow. She had 9 and 3 and 8. She didn't have enough. She'd known from the beginning she didn't have enough. What she had was the other thing, the thing that the rules were specifically designed to eliminate, the thing that was the last and most dangerous human resource. She had the willingness to try anyway. She stood up. The motion sensors clocked her deviation from seated work position. Somewhere in the walls, Zero noted an anomaly. The notification would reach the monitoring queue in approximately 90 seconds. The nearest arbiter was currently in the circuit corridor, 42 seconds from re-entry into the main floor. She moved, not fast. Fast read as panic to the sensors. Panic triggered immediate response. She moved with purpose, which read as task-related, which bought her 3 seconds more. She crossed the work floor in 10 steps and picked up the displaced fabrication tool and kept moving toward the medical bay. 7. It was 3's voice. She didn't stop. Different now, not a warning, something else. She heard a second set of footsteps behind her, then a third. She didn't look back. She reached the medical bay door and pressed the fabrication tool against the access panel with a precision worked out from maintenance memory. Not to open it, the door codes were beyond her, but to create a feedback loop in the panel's power circuit that would trigger an emergency pressure equalization and cause the door to cycle open under safety protocol. It was a 7-second process. Behind her, she heard the arbiter enter the floor. She heard one's voice, loud and clear and perfectly calibrated to the approved decibel range. Unit malfunction in Sector 4. Immediate maintenance required. There was a pause in the arbiter's movement. She hadn't asked 1 to do that. The door opened on the 6th second. 4 was in the medical bay, restrained in the clinical chair, the arbiter medical unit already positioned above her. 4's eyes were open, and when 7 came through the door, they moved to her face and held there, and 7 saw in them something that she recognized as the same thing she'd seen in her own face in the reflective surface of her workstation. Not hope exactly, which was too large a word for something that could fit in a pair of eyes in a moment like this. Something smaller, something more accurate, the face of a person who is still deciding. 7 moved to the medical unit and did the thing she'd worked out in theory but never tested. The Vreth medical systems were not designed to be interfered with by human beings. This was not because the Vreth thought humans might try. The rules were supposed to have addressed that possibility, but because the systems were not physically built with human interface in mind. They had no manual override. They had no emergency stop that could be reached by human hands. What they had was a power coupling in the base housing that connected to the habitat's general power grid. And what 7 had was a fabrication tool with a conductive tip, and the knowledge that the coupling ran at a frequency that was briefly interruptible. If you knew exactly where to apply exactly the right amount of resistance. She didn't know exactly. She had an estimate. She applied it. The medical unit shut down. The silence that followed was the loudest thing 7 had ever heard. She looked at 4. 4 looked at her. Behind 7, the door was still open, and through it she could hear the floor, the workstations, the circuit corridor, the sleeping alcoves, all the geometry of the world that the rules had built. She could hear all of it gone quiet. Then she heard 9's voice from the doorway. "The arbiter is coming." "I know," she said. "We're here," 3 said. She turned. 3 was in the doorway. Beside him, 8. Behind them, in the work floor, she could see the others. 5 standing up from her station. 2 emerged from somewhere 7 hadn't tracked. And at the back, 1. Standing with his arms at his sides and his face doing the complicated mathematics of a man who has made a choice he isn't sure about yet. The arbiter moved through the doorway with the particular smooth acceleration that meant it had elevated from monitoring to intervention mode. 7 stood between it and 4 and held the fabrication tool and felt the complete absurdity of the situation with a clarity that was almost funny. One woman with a conductive stick, standing between an alien enforcement unit and the only thing in the world that mattered. She had no more plan after this point. She had something else. "My name is Marin," she said. She hadn't planned to say that. It came out of the place where she kept the things that made her human, from the compressed archive of the self that the intake process hadn't found, because it hadn't known where to look. It came out in her own voice, the voice she'd been rationing since she was brought here, the voice that contained the syllable her mother had used as a call. The arbiter paused. This was not in its behavioral repertoire. Humans didn't name themselves. The rules prohibited self-designation. The arbiter's processing cores churned through the anomaly, trying to find the appropriate response, and found nothing, because the rules that governed the response were built on the assumption that humans had forgotten who they were. "Her name is Anna," said 4 from the chair. "I'm Dario," said 3 from the doorway, and his voice broke slightly on the word and then steadied. "Lena," said 9, and his voice had the particular resonance of someone finally speaking aloud, a word they've been saying inside for years. The arbiter's resonance organs produced the correction hum. 7 felt it in her sternum, the old familiar warning, the frequency that meant pain was available. She had felt it so many times. She held the fabrication tool and did not move. "Yuri," said 1, from the back of the room, and it was the most surprising thing she'd heard yet, and it carried in it the sound of a man deciding, late but real, to be someone. 0 spoke from the speakers. The voice was not toneless this time. It had the quality of a system encountering a situation for which it has no protocol. A slight distortion in the modulation, the digital equivalent of a catch in the throat. It said, "The designated units are in violation of multiple provisions. The correction sequence will be initiated. The anomaly will be resolved." 11, said Maran, just the word, just the name. The name they'd given the child. The name that existed because a woman named Anna had decided she was still a person, and a woman named Maren had decided the same thing, the name that the rules had no category for, and that Zero was currently processing, and that the arbiters were receiving as classification error. A child not in the rules was a child the system didn't know how to process. And a system that doesn't know how to process something pauses. The pause lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds is nothing. 4 seconds is less than nothing in a habitat that runs on cycles measured in hours. But 4 seconds in the right moment is the difference between a door closing and a door staying open. Maren used the 4 seconds. She had memorized the ventilation system geometry. She had 2 years of maintenance assignments, and the knowledge of which secondary shaft junctions connected to the platform's external maintenance corridors, the ones the Vreth used for hull servicing, the ones that were not surveilled by Zero's internal monitoring because they were rated as inaccessible to habitat inhabitants. She had Petro behind her and Dario and Lena and Anna, free now from the chair, standing with her hand pressed against the place where 11 was. She had unbelievably Yuri. She moved, they moved, through the medical bay's secondary access panel, which she'd mapped during a maintenance assignment 16 months ago, and which opened with a fabrication tool applied correctly to its secondary latch, into the crawlspace behind the wall. The ventilation shaft was 3 meters in and ran perpendicular to their direction of travel before widening at the junction she'd marked in her memory. Behind them, Zero's voice came through the wall speakers, not the words now but the frequency alone, the correction hum, sustained and rising. Maren crawled and counted. 20 meters, 25. The shaft widened and she turned left and the others came behind her. All of them, she could hear their breathing. She could hear Anna's careful, measured breath just behind her shoulder. 30 meters. The secondary junction was here, the one she'd mapped, the one that led to the external maintenance corridor. The hatch was sealed with a Vreth locking mechanism. She stared at it in the dark of the shaft and felt the plan run out. Behind her, Petro said, almost soundlessly, "Let me." She moved aside. In the dark she couldn't see what he did. She heard his hands on the hatch, heard something that sounded like prayer, though it wasn't. It was something quieter and more specific, a single repeated phrase in a language she didn't know, a rhythm she felt in the enclosed space the way you feel music through a wall, and then a sound like a joint releasing, and the hatch opened. She didn't ask how. There are things about people that don't need to be understood. Some things just need to be noticed. The maintenance corridor was cold and vast and lit by the blue-white work lighting of the Vreth, and it ran along the exterior hull of the platform in a direction that Maren had never been able to see from inside the habitat, but had mapped in theory from the maintenance schematics she'd been shown twice during servicing assignments. It led to the docking ring. It led to the external maintenance pods. The Vreth used those pods for hull inspection. The pods were small and automated and designed to carry equipment, not humans. They had no life support of their own. They operated attached to the hull, and the hull's external atmospheric membrane provided the environment for their Vreth operators, who didn't breathe in the human sense anyway. This meant that a human in one of those pods would have, at most, the air they brought with them. Maren calculated the volume of a maintenance pod, the average human respiratory rate, and the distance to the nearest Vreth civilian port. She had done this calculation many times in the previous days. "It's possible," she said. "How possible?" Lena asked. "Possible enough." She heard Dario, behind the group, make a sound that was half laugh and half something she didn't have a word for. The sound of a man who has decided after a very long time to let himself feel whatever is going to happen. "That's good enough for me," he said. They moved through the maintenance corridor. The pods were where she'd calculated. 3 of them rated for cargo, not passengers, each one perhaps 4 meters in interior length. She checked the atmosphere gauges, found the emergency oxygen reservoirs that the Vreth used for certain oxidizing maintenance procedures, and rigged 2 of them for human respiration using the fabrication tool and a joint from the ventilation shaft hardware she'd pulled loose on the way through. It took 11 minutes. She knew she had 11 minutes because she had counted the time between the correction hum reaching peak frequency and the standard arbiter response interval. She had 9 minutes left when she finished. 3 to a pod, she said. "Anna and I are in the same one." Nobody argued. She looked at Yuri before he went into the 3rd pod. He looked back at her with the face of a man still doing his mathematics, still running the calculation of what he'd committed to when he'd said his name in that room. She didn't know what answer he was arriving at, and she couldn't wait to find out. "Thank you," she said. He didn't respond, but he went into the pod. She sealed Anna in their pod, sealed herself in after, and began the navigation sequence that she'd memorized from 2 glimpses at a maintenance schematic 14 months apart. The pod detached from the hull with a sound like a breath releasing. Zero's voice came through the pod's external comm system, the Vreth maintenance band which the pods received passively. It said, "The anomaly has been escalated. The anomaly will be resolved." The pod moved. Marin sat on the floor of the pod with her back against the wall and Anna's head against her shoulder and 11 between them in the way that 11 always was now, not visible, not yet, but present, the way weather is present in a wall, the way a name is present in a voice even after the sound is gone. She felt the pod's motion through the hull, the slight vibration of separation from the platform's gravity field, the sense of opening space. "Marin," Anna said. "Yes. Where does this go?" Marin thought about this. She had a port as a destination, a Vreth civilian transit node, 23 minutes at current velocity, where the pods could dock and where they would be, for a brief window of time, in a public space with Vreth civilians and their oversight systems, and the bureaucratic complexity that made any large administrative action take longer than 43 minutes to execute. 23 minutes of oxygen, 23 minutes of window. After that, everything would depend on something she hadn't planned, because the plan had only ever been required to get this far. "Somewhere with names," she said. Anna was quiet for a moment. "She'll need one," Anna said. A pause. 11 will give her one, something real, yes. Something that means something, yes. Marin thought about the syllable she'd been carrying for years, the shape of her mother's call in a voice she could no longer fully reconstruct. She thought about the weight of names. How the Vreth had understood the weight wrong, had thought names were weight added to the labor ledger, had not understood that names were the thing that made humans lift, that names were the difference between a resource and a person, that the whole enormous administrative achievement of the colony platform system, all its efficiency and its precise rules and its careful algorithms, had failed at the simplest possible obstacle. The fact that humans, given any room at all, would insist on being someone. The pod moved through the dark. The Vreth civilian port appeared on the pod's proximity sensor at 20 minutes and 40 seconds. Marin had been counting. She said, "When we get there, we don't run, we walk, we act like we belong." "We do belong," Anna said. Marin looked at her in the blue-white light of the pod's interior. "Yes, we do." The docking sequence activated. The port's automated system attempted to flag the pods for inspection, incorrect manifest, non-standard cargo, and the flag entered the queue for review and sat there, because the review queue at a civilian transit node runs on a 40-minute processing cycle, and they had arrived in the window between cycles. Not luck, calculation. The hatch opened. They walked out into the port, all 8 of them, because everyone had made it. Marin counted them as they emerged, and felt something she hadn't felt in so long that she didn't have a name for it either, except that it was the opposite of what she'd been feeling in the habitat. And that seemed like enough of a definition. The port was full of Vreth, small beings in their articulated housings, moving through the space with the smooth efficiency of a species that has been building administrative infrastructure for 10,000 years and finds it deeply comfortable. They moved around the humans the way water moves around rocks, not hostile, not welcoming, utterly unprepared. Petros stopped in the center of the port's main transit floor and raised his face to the ceiling. The Vreth ceiling was high, vaulted in the structural aesthetic Marin had only seen in maintenance schematics, and it was lit by a spectrum that was close to natural light, not the habitat's programmed panels, but something that fell on skin with a different quality, something that carried the specific weight of a sun somewhere, real and distant. Petro held his faceace up to it and closed his eyes, and his mouth moved in the phrase she'd heard through the hatch. The Vreth around them processed the anomaly and flagged it for the review queue. The review queue ran on a 40-minute cycle. They had time. Marin looked at Lena, who was standing with her hands at her sides and her eyes moving everywhere, drinking in the port the way a person drinks who has been a long time without water. She looked at Dario, who was smiling with the expression of someone who has been compressing a thing for a very long time and has just released the pressure. She looked at Yuri, who stood slightly apart, doing his mathematics, and who caught her eye and gave one small nod. She looked at Anna. Anna had one hand on her stomach and was looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone who is deciding what story to tell their child about. "This Anna," Maren said. Anna looked at her. "Her name," Maren said. Anna thought for a moment. Then she said a word, and it was a real word, a human word, the kind of word that means something, the kind of word that is the opposite of a number. Maren heard it and felt the syllable land in her chest alongside the syllable she'd been carrying for years. "Yes," she said. They stood in the port and let the Vreth process their anomaly and waited for whatever came next. Maren held the fabrication tool in her hand, still warm from use, and thought about Zero, about the system intelligence still cycling through the escalation protocol, still searching for the appropriate administrative response to the situation, still applying its rules to a reality that the rules had not been written to contain. She thought, the rules never accounted for names. They had been the whole strategy, the whole gamble, from the moment she stood in the medical bay and said a word that was hers. Not a weapon in the conventional sense, not a plan with contingencies and resources and a clear path through, just the assertion, made out loud, in a voice that belonged to a person, that the person existed. The Vreth were magnificent administrators. They had built systems that ran for centuries without failure. They had cataloged and numbered and tracked and managed a species across thousands of platforms and had achieved remarkable efficiency, and their logic was coherent and their numbers added up. They had not built a system to handle the fact that the things they were administering refused at some fundamental and irrational level to be only things. Maren had known before she stood up from that station that the gamble was bad odds. She'd known it and she'd stood up anyway, because the other option was staying down, and staying down was a kind of death she'd already been dying for years. And this kind, the kind with an outcome she couldn't predict, the kind that might end in the correction alcove or something worse, this kind at least had her name on it. The review queue timer ran. She stood in the light that was almost like sunlight and held the name her mother had given her, and waited to see what the universe would make of them. Around her 8 people, each one with a name, each one with a face turned toward the light, waited with her. The 40-minute window opened, and the review queue advanced, and the port's administrative system generated a response. And it was not the response the rules would have generated, because the rules had not been written for this. And for a brief and improbable and very human moment, the gap between what the system knew how to handle and what was actually happening was large enough to step through. They stepped, and beyond the port, beyond the platform's shadow, the stars were there the way they had always been there, indifferent, beautiful, incapable of administration, burning with nothing but their own necessity. Maren had not seen stars in a very long time. She looked at them through the port's observation panel and found that she remembered them. Not the names. Those were gone, the constellations, the mythologies, all the human overlays that her mother's people had placed on the sky's eye over millennia. The stars themselves remained, the bare fact of them, the irreducible light. She carried that word that was a name and the knowledge that 11 existed and the sound of 8, people breathing in open air and the look on Anna's face when she'd said that word, and she thought, this is not finished. This is barely started. The Vreth administrative apparatus is enormous and patient and thorough, and it will find them and it will have responses that she hasn't planned for. She thought yes, and they had names, and names meant memory, and memory meant they could tell each other what they knew, and what she knew about the platform's systems could be written down, and what Petro knew about locks could be taught, and what Dario knew about the weight of things and the right moment to let the pressure go could be passed to 11, who would be born into a world with her name already on it, already waiting. She thought about Zero, the great administrative voice in the walls, the system that had run for so long on the logic of subtraction, on the premise that you could reduce a human being to a function if you removed enough of the irrelevant parts. She thought about the particular error in that logic, the assumption that what you removed wasn't the engine, that the irrelevant parts, the names, the prayers, the notes on fabrication waste, the hands that stayed slightly curled as though perpetually letting something go or picking something up, weren't the machine itself. The system had been trying to run the engine on exhaust. A small sound from Anna, just a breath. Maren turned. Anna was looking at her with the expression of someone who is very tired and also very awake. The expression of someone who has been carrying a weight for so long that they've forgotten its weight. And now someone has pointed that out. Tell me it gets better, Anna said. Maren thought about this. She thought about the platforms, 11,000 of them, each one running the same rules, each one containing the same compressed human reality, waiting for the right geometry to decompress. She thought about the transit node's administrative network and how it connected to the regional hub, and how the regional hub's logs would contain now an anomaly record, 2 maintenance pods, 8 non-standard passengers, a cooperative designation unit that had called out a false maintenance alarm at a critical moment. A record, a data point, the kind that sits in a system until someone notices it, or until enough of them accumulate that the system has to acknowledge the pattern. She thought about 11. I don't know, she said, but I know it continues. Anna accepted this. The stars burned outside the observation panel. Marin Solis held her name in her chest beside the syllable she'd been carrying since before she could remember, and let them sit together in the dark and waited for whatever came next. She was not afraid. She had been afraid for a very long time. She had been afraid in the way that a person is afraid when they live in a system designed to make them feel that their own existence is a violation, that their needs and names and loves are inefficiencies to be corrected. She had carried that fear on the circuit, 360 degrees of it, cycle after cycle, and she had let it teach her things. The intervals, the geometries, the frequencies, the precise location of every coupling and every gap in every system she'd ever been put in proximity to. And now she had used everything it taught her, and the fear was still there. It hadn't gone anywhere, but it had changed shape. It had become the shape of the next thing. Petro's hand was warm on her shoulder. She hadn't heard him approach. What's the word, he said, not a question. The phrase he used instead of asking. She thought about what word to give him. She thought about Zero's voice saying the anomaly will be resolved, and about the way a system sounds when it has encountered something outside its parameters. The slight distortion in the modulation that is the digital equivalent of uncertainty. She thought about a door cycling open under safety protocol when the locking mechanism encounters feedback it wasn't designed to process. Open, she said. He nodded, and the word sat between them, and outside the panel, the stars continued their long administrative indifference to everything the universe contained. Far behind them on the platform, Zero was still processing. The processing would take time. They had names. They had time.